All right. Welcome to Critique 613. So we turn today to Michel Foucault's fourth and final volume of The History of Sexuality. It has a unique posture in the series insofar as it is both a classic text and a relatively unknown text at the same time. And this is due naturally to its delayed publication, despite the fact that many readers have known of its existence, have read it, and have also read portions of it through the lectures at the Collège de France from 1980 to 1984. By way of background, just to situate the book, it's essential to remind everyone of its history. As you will recall, in 1976, when Foucault published Volume 1 of The History of Sexuality, he had indicated on the back of the Volume 1 that there were going to be 5 books to follow. And you recall it was La chair et le corps, so the flesh and the body, La croix des enfants, which was going to be on children, La femme, mère hystérique, which would be on women, mothers, and the hysteric figure, Les pervers, and Population et race. And those were the 5 books that would follow. Now, manuscript versions of the first 2 of those, volumes 2 and 3, are in the Foucault archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. But as Foucault was writing those, he began to have his doubts. And he felt he needed to explore in greater depth the question of subject creation, of subjectivation. He began to realize he needed to reach further back in history, and he revised his plans for publication. As you know, Foucault spells this out beautifully and elegantly in the introduction to Volume 2 of The History of Sexuality, The Use of Pleasure, in a section called Modification at the beginning of that text, which is I would say, a foundational text to understand Foucault's work. Now, 8 years later, in 1984, Foucault then published a revised plan for the history of sexuality, along with, at that time, 2 volumes. Now, in the volume 2 that was published in 1984, there was a small a leaflet that was attached, which was called a prière d'insérer, and it had on it the change in the plan as well as the new project for 4-volume history of sexuality, rather than 6. And so these would then include the 2 that were published in 1984, L'usage des plaisirs, Volume 2, The Use of Pleasures, and Le souci de soi, The Care of the Self, Volume 3, in 1984. The second, in other words, L'usage des plaisirs, Volume 2, being on Greek antiquity and on issues of aphrodisia, and Volume 3 being on the Greco-Roman philosophers of the 1st and 2nd century, and on the practices of the self, on the care of the self. And of course, there was a planned Volume 4 on the early Christian fathers, Les Aveux de la Chair. Now that final volume, Volume 4, was the one that he actually completed first. So that was the one that he had written first. And there are various different ideas as to when exactly it was written, but it was probably written in the period 1980-81. And he finalized it and turned it over to Gallimard in 1982. And that was the manuscript. Essentially, that's the manuscript that's been published now. It was turned over to Gallimard in 1982, and Foucault at that point said, well, hold on. Even though we're going to be publishing this, I need to go further back and finish these other volumes, Volume 2 and 3, which at the time were just 1 volume on antiquity, on the Greco-Roman period. And that's what he did. So he then wrote those, and they were published April 1984, May 1984, shortly before his death. And he was actually making corrections then on the final volume, Les Aveux de la Chair, when he passed away in June 1984. As a result, of course, it didn't appear at that time, and he never had the opportunity really to go back to it to the extent possibly that he might have after having completed and published volumes 2 and 3. What we have essentially is a manuscript which he was correcting, so we know that he was in the process of correcting it, but there are questions as to whether or not it may have had had a conclusion, a different conclusion, or perhaps possibly an introduction, although Volume 3 really didn't have an introduction. Volume 3 used the same introduction from Volume 2, so it's possible that it would have just used the introduction from Volume 2. But what we have essentially is the manuscript. It's been edited masterfully by Frédéric Gros, who was also in charge of many of the courses during this period, 80 through 84. Now, as you know, the fourth and final volume, so it prolongs Foucault's meticulous archival project of unearthing and exposing the manner in which social, cultural, religious, and ethical practices have shaped humans during different historical periods. So it completes chronologically the second and third volumes, pushing the analysis from Greek antiquity to the early Common Era philosophers to the early Christian thinkers of the 1st to 5th centuries. The archive in this volume are the early church scholars and ascetics, what are often referred to as the Christian fathers, from early Greek thinkers such as Clement of Alexandria, Origen, John Chrysostom, to the early Latin fathers such as Tertullian, Ambrose, and John Cassian, through the great church father, St. Augustine. Now, you're all familiar, of course, with the general arc and the theory that he was developing in these now 3 last volumes, right? And what he shows us is that whereas in Volume 2, the ancient Greeks around the 6th century, before the Common Era, understood sexual relations primarily through the framework of aphrodisia, a philosophical understanding that focused on the idea of an ethical self-mastery intended to prevent the subject from getting consumed by the pleasures of sexual relations and to conform them to the type of social relations between sexual actors. And whereas the Greek and Roman philosophers of the early Common Era, especially the Stoics, conceptualized sexual relations primarily through the techniques of the self, such as the examination of self, the memorization of rules of austerity, practices of penitence, and such. And by contrast to us moderns, whom he had developed in Volume 1 of The Will to Know, who invented psychoanalytic, medical, and legal frameworks to regulate our sexuality, that in contrast to those 3 periods, the early Christian thinkers deployed a framework of lust, of flesh, of sin, as a way to curb and regulate sexual relations. There are a number of scholars who have written excellent pieces on the new book, excellent reviews and analyses of them, including Stuart Eldon, Daniele Lorenzini, Nancy Luxon, Sver Arafsnoe, Joseph Tanky, among others. And they're all available on the website, so if you look at the readings, you can link to them and read those reviews. One of the kind of most surprising features of the book, which is one of the core theories, is that there was much more continuity from the ancient Greeks to the Christian fathers than there might have been between the Christian fathers and us today. As Daniele Lorenzini notes in an important paper that you should read, and that's also on the blog, the foil here is Nietzsche. Foucault's history of the subject of desire, as he writes, questions Friedrich Nietzsche's claim that it was Christianity with its fundamental ressentiment against life that first made sexuality into something unclean. Right? So, Pace Nietzsche, Foucault dispels the idea that Christianity radically transformed the relation to sex or invented the suspicion of pleasure. In this respect, he draws on these early writings, on the Stoics, and on the ancients to, throughout the book, kind of suggest continuity, right? It's a story of continuity with a shift. And the shift being, the subtle shift being, not kind of all of a sudden Christian repression of sexuality, but rather the shift being a different way of subject creation, a different form of subjectivation. The shift is one where there's the emergence of a subject of lust and a subject of law that are combined finally in the work of Saint Augustine. Now, we can go back for a second to the Prière d'insérer in the second volume and see where he was going, and of course note the parallels with what we are doing this evening and what we're doing with this seminar. The initial project of the series, he writes, exposed in The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, The Will to Know, was not to reconstitute the historical sequence of sexual conducts and practices, nor to analyze the ideas by means of which these behaviors were represented, it is written, but rather to comprehend how, in modern Western societies, there was constituted something like an experience of sexuality, this familiar notion that nevertheless does not appear before the beginning of the 19th century. And when he turns to the Confessions of the Flesh, it's written, finally, Confessions of the Flesh will treat the experience of the flesh in the first centuries of Christianity and the role that hermeneutics and the purifying deciphering of desire played. Now, once more, as with our last session on reading capital, and I think you can see the parallels here to our project, which again should not escape you. To read these texts for purposes of understanding our present conjuncture, at least here in the West, and guide us in our practices. To understand, as he suggests there, modern Western societies. That's the challenge, I think, that we have today, this evening, to read this brilliant text about the patristic tradition, so an old archive, in order to better understand our present, to better understand critique today, and to better formulate praxis. And to help us guide that, to help us guide us with this project, and to deploy Foucault's final volume, we're delighted to welcome Guillaume Leblanc from the University of Paris, Diderot. Guillaume Leblanc is professor of philosophy at the University of Paris, Diderot, specializing in 20th century French philosophy in relation with continental philosophy, also critical theory and social and political philosophy. He was previously a professor of social philosophy at the University of Paris, Créteil, and before that, a professor of philosophy at the University of Bordeaux, and he's also been a visiting professor of philosophy in Quebec, Hamburg, München, Kyoto, and Brussels. He has many publications and has written a lot both on Foucault and in other areas of contemporary philosophy. He wrote La Pensée Foucault in 2015. He's also written on Canguilhem. Your dissertation was on Canguilhem. Most recently, he's written a book called Vaincre nos peurs, tendre la main, which is out in Flammarion 2018. La fin de l'hospitalité, which was written with another philosopher, Fabienne Brugère, out in 2017. L'insurrection des vies minuscules, and many other books. Les malades de l'homme normal, Canguilhem et les normes, and also a book on running called Courir, Méditation Physique. Guillaume has posted a brilliant article, a full-length article about this volume 4, Les Aveux de la Chair, both, and we've got it both in English. Xavier Fleury made an extraordinary translation into English of volume 4. That's on the blog. I would recommend that you read those and you meditate with them. Today, though, you will synthesize that, and I'll let you start by presenting the thesis of your paper.
Thank you. As Foucault. I also would like to thank generously Guylaine, who made my coming possible. And a very big thank to Xavier for the wonderful translation. So, during my talk, I would like to emphasize what seems to me a contradiction, but perhaps just a contradiction between the old historical materials studied by Foucault, namely a group of texts about Christian flesh by the Christian fathers between the 2nd and the 5th centuries, and the use we can make today. I would like, during my talk, very quickly focus in the first part of my presentation on 3 central ideas that are taken from the point of historical origin. First one, that the subject ended up being an entirely sexual subject. Second, that the subject has to speak truth of his sexuality. And third, that he has to confess his sexuality within the confines of a very particular apparatus. Sexual subject, speaking the truth of oneself, and confession are, therefore, the 3 great theoretical operations that circulate in the text. And I would like very shortly to summarize them before having a broader question on the use we can make today. So, first idea, the subject for sexuality. At the point of departure, there is a question that is the same as what we find in the will to knowledge. How did we become our sexuality? As Arnold Davidson writes in his book, The Emergence of Sexuality, quotation, we are our sexuality. We cannot think of ourselves, of our most fundamental psychological identity, without thinking of our sexuality, that reveals the type of individual that we are. What is radical in the history of sexuality is that sexuality has a history, which means at first, that sexuality is not timeless and innate, but rather a constriction that depends on power and discourses. Can we grasp the moment in this history when the subject becomes attached to her sexuality, or when what was a problem for the subject, his sexuality, becomes his truth? Foucault explains that it is in the Christian moment between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD that the two became bound. The paradox is that this Beidin happened precisely thanks to the renouncement of the flesh, as Foucault shows it for virginity. I'll cite a remarkable passage, a quotation. The valorization of virginity is quite different from the disqualification of a simple and pure prohibition of sexual relations. It implies, a considerable valorization of the individual's relationship to her own sexual conduct, since it turns this relationship into a positive experience. To be clear, says Foucault, this is not to say that Christianity positively valorized the sexual act itself, but precisely the negative value assigned to the sexual act gave it a centrality that it never attained in Greek or Roman morality. This is a quite incredible passage, I think, because Foucault ends up saying that the refusal of sexuality gives rise to a way of life, virginity, but reveals, in contrast, the importance of sexual activity for the subject. The obsession with the renouncement of sex is therefore the sign of a true obsession with sex on the part of the subject. Second idea, truth-telling about one's sexuality. The relation between the self and the truth is at the center of Confessions of the Flesh. What does it mean to tell the truth of oneself? What price does the individual pay by telling the truth? And moreover, what does it take for her to consider that telling the truth of herself is the very condition of a true relation to the self? This is a point of great importance for us today. I mean, Foucault, as we know, revealed the desire for truth since antiquity, except that the Greeks and the Romans did not link this desire for truth with sexuality. Sexuality was about a good usage of pleasures, an ideal of control and energy. But the desire for truth became linked to the part of us called sexuality, implied that sexuality had, in a sense, become our truth. And I think, as I will show in the second part of my talk, that we still have not escaped this vision. Here, the general project of the history of sexuality becomes clear: to undertake a genealogy of a man of desire, in which the obligation to tell truth of his desires, his impulses, his inclinations, his obsessions, ends up as the essential rupture of a whole endeavor. It is precisely this rupture that leads to the development of a Christian pastoral between the 2nd and 5th centuries. Foucault formulates his question in the following terms: why, wrote he, why, when he have done wrong, do we need to bring forth the truth, not only of what we did, but of who we are, Third idea, the confession. Foucault leads a final pertinent reflection on how the structure of the confession itself tends to be constitutive of being a subject. Confessing can be understood from the point of view of a confessor, replacing the director of conscience from antiquity, was only there to direct action and not to pronounce his verdict on the subject. Foucault shows how this confession is an integral part of the pastoral government of individuals. This obligation to tell the truth of oneself and of one's wrongdoing becomes then a mode of government. This is what Foucault identifies in the two grand strategies: penitence as truth-doing and confession as truth-telling. That confession soon eclipses penitence indicates clearly an ever closer link between admission and confession that Foucault has already noted in The Will to Knowledge. Quotation: admission was and remains today the general matrix that presides over the production of truth discourses about sex. Admission now convokes the subject in his deepest interior. It's no longer a question, writes Foucault, of saying what has been done, a sexual act, and how, but rather to reconstruct around this act and within it the thoughts that doubled the thought, the desires and accompanying obsessions. Thus, through historical investigations that span 3 centuries and take in baptism, confession, virginity, and marriage, Foucault's goal is to reconstruct the Christian techniques that makes an individual confess his most intimate thoughts and most secret desires. For us today, I think it's essential to underline what I would call the emergence of mental sexuality, the libidinization of sex that Foucault analyzes in the work of Augustine, Saint Augustin, from the 5th century, implies that the libido triumphs not only over the body, but also and more over the soul as well. What is this libido? The surging of an involuntary movement in place of something voluntary, describes Foucault. Augustine discovered, before Freud in a certain sense, that sex is a mental affair. It's in the soul itself, writes Foucault, that Saint Augustine seeks to place the principle of concupiscence and the involuntary point of departure that passes through. Which is to say, in fact, if a libido resides in the soul, one has to watch and scrutinize it in order to purge all bad thoughts. We are left with an infinite task of self-observation and interpretation, which makes confession to a priest a necessary form of admission. So, what signification? I've shortly summarized these 3 main ideas of his last book, Volume 4 of History of Sexuality. And now I think we can ask ourselves more deeply, what signification can we give to the confession of the flesh today? Is it a book only devoted to the study of the past, or can we make a use of this book for us today? I think 2 elements become very important in the demonstration of Foucault. That is to say, first truth and then law, truth and right, so to speak. They become 2 historically distinct entry points into the experience of sexuality. Foucault presents these entry points when discussing the differences between monastic life and matrimony in Christian culture. The difference is very important for the diffusion of Christianity. It was the problem. How can Christianity develop its own pattern? The monastic ideal places the monk outside the world, and matrimony, by contrast, codifies a Christian way of living within the world. And it is thus vital that the first not become the norm of the second. The separation between the house of God, the monastery, and the home, matrimony, leads to 2 different relations to sexuality that Foucault presents from the perspective of truth, truthfulness first, and from the perspective of a form of life, lawfulness second. On the one hand, everyone in the monastery has an obligation to tell the truth about his desires and thoughts. Monastic asceticism consists in, I quote, practices of constant self-surveillance, the deciphering of one's own secrets. That is to say that the subject has an obligation to truthfulness in the deciphering of his own flesh, and by contrast, as a form of life, so to speak, however, this is the institution of marriage that fixes the boundaries of Christian life for everyone. In this perspective, in this second perspective, marriage implies an ensemble of reciprocal debts between the man and woman that thus become a form of jurisdiction. I quote Foucault, the theme of debt will give rise to a constant work of codification and to a long reflection on jurisprudence. And this is the final reflection from Foucault to Augustine. I know Bernard will develop this point. What is remarkable for me in Foucault's analysis is that it doesn't try to unify these 2 great experiences of sexuality. That is to say, telling the truth of oneself on the one way, and placing oneself in a juridical economy of sexuality in the marriage, with Augustine on the other way. He maintains the difference, which he calls dimorphism. The experience of sexuality, therefore, is reflected in two different forms. For Foucault, the separation between these two forms is central to our experience of sexuality. And he argues that it is precisely this difference that constitutes the sexual culture in the West that has remained until now, to this day. I cite a crucial passage. The dimorphism will become more and more pronounced and will profoundly mark our way of thinking and policing sexual behavior in the West. In terms of truth, but in the form of a secret at the center of a self that needs to be infinitely elucidated if we want to be saved, and in terms of the law, but in the forms of debts and obligations as much as in the form of prohibition and transgression. This dimorphism, adds Foucault, is far from disappearing, or at least its effects are far from exhausted. Thus, we see two different points of entry into the experience of sexuality by the truth and by the right. So we have to ask then, and today, how can we repeat or not the diagnosis of Foucault? Our experience of sexuality is marked by a search for truth and legality. On the one hand, the truth-telling has not disappeared at all, of course. It is simply no longer articulated, I think, as a confession of one's sin, but rather as a declaration of one's sexual style. More than ever, it is organized in the form of a narration of a self, in which each of us presents her, him, them, itself, as a sexual subject of certain style. Heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, and so on. The structure of the address hasn't disappeared at all, and thus neither has the admission, but it now takes multiple forms, which are also modes of exposing the self, including on the internet, as Bernard Harcourt has shown in his own book, Exposed. There are also narrations of a self addressed to medical institutions in order to change one's sex as part of psychiatric therapy, which are amplified operations of truth-telling. On the other hand, regarding to the law, sex subject is more and more a law subject. The right to marriage for homosexual couples, the right to adoption, medically assisted procreation, surrogacy, and so on. The question, what about the validity of a dimorphism to signify our experience of sexuality today, should be posed. The sexual revolution that started in the 60s has made things, I think, clearly changed. This change, I would formulate it radically. Sexuality has become our own business. This doesn't mean that the basic dimorphism, truthfulness and lawfulness, has disappeared. And how could it, given the extent to which sexuality is a social and cultural formation? But if these two entry points into sexuality have not disappeared, they tend, in my opinion, to become one. It's precisely this unification that renders sexuality each person's business, as I tend to show now. It means that we are seeing re-articulations of what we are as sexual subjects that specify how we are to live our sexuality in juridical terms. To understand this major change, we have to bring it back to its origins in the egalitarian struggles of women first and sexual minorities then. The schema of a dimorphism of the flesh in Christian culture is in fact a gendered schema written in advance by and for men who see in women a piece of property. The history of sexuality, and this fourth volume does not escape this schema, is in this sense a masculinist history of sexuality in which the counter-history of sexuality of women barely appears. Hence the critics of American feminists, for example, on the Anti-Project and the Will to Knowledge in particular. This also explains why the book, which appears to us 15 years after it was written, is at once both as familiar and so familiar and so strange. So familiar because despite the extreme Christian renouncement of the flesh, it is nonetheless our psychological subject that was created through this process of which Freud, in a sense, was one endpoint, in which the great task was to decipher oneself, starting with one's desire. And yet strange, in a way, very strange, because this idea of desires as an interpretation of a self takes place within the framework of extreme inequality of the sexes. That is no longer imaginable. That is no doubt the crucial point, the erasure of female voices and thereby of all marginalized sexualities in the constitution of a sexual self. If we are situated by contrast in an egalitarian framework, truthfulness and lawfulness have not disappeared, but rather coagulated and been almost absorbed in the same ensemble. To ask the truth of a self, of a certain gender, truthfulness, and to access legitimate practices of sexuality, lawfulness, are intertwined processes. The obligation to say the truth of one's sexuality corresponds to the right to exercise one's sexuality correctly or truly. But thus, it is no longer a relationship between wrongdoing and truth-telling of the old Christian culture, but rather a new relationship between doing well and telling truth, which becomes, if not the norm, then at least our experience of sexuality. To be more precise, one could say, from the moment we consider truth-telling about our sexuality to be a fundamental experience of subjectivity, we can start articulating a whole new category of rights. From the moment I say what I am sexually, when I have the courage to come out of a closet, something like a right to a true sexuality becomes plausible and legitimate. Homosexual demands made since the closets have opened led to marriage for all. In other words, we tell the truth of our sexuality in part to open up a certain number of rights. Truthfulness becomes the necessary condition of lawfulness. This leads to a new culture of the self, I think, in which we move from the injunction to admit one's desire to the confessor to the desire to publicly announce what one is sexually in order to fully live one's life. This seems like a new experience at work. We can see, and I will conclude by this direction, we can see that the Christian episteme, so to speak, was heavily marked by the inequality between men and women. Whereas now we have completely abandoned this episteme with a strong affirmation of the equality of sexual partners. There is now the assumption that this equality must be taken as the prerequisite for any and all sexual activity. It leads us to the idea of mutual consent and the idea that it is precisely by remaining owners of our bodies that we can enjoy the sexual act. Our era is thus particularly interesting, I think, now, and must be interrogated through the following question. What's sexuality, in fact, in a context of radical equality? These coincides with a growing demand for lawfulness as understood through the importance of consent and its translation into legal recourse. Thus, we are moving towards a common culture of good and authorized sexualities. These good sexualities, so to speak, no longer lead to a distinction between normal and pathological, healthy and deviant, but rather are based on the common demand that each of us to be the author of our own sexuality. And by a common culture of sexuality, one must understand that the realization of a sexual subject now passes through the politicization of sexuality, the activism of a fully active subject who is fighting for a new sexual collectivity. All of these is, of course, not foreign to the famous Big Bang that Bernard spoke of in the third seminar dedicated to Beauvoir. Isn't Big Bang just another name? I would put the question. Isn't Big Bang just another name for a sexual revelation that started with the denaturalization of sexuality, which Beauvoir undertook in The Second Sex, and of which Foucault's history of sexuality and also of gender trouble, for example, of Butler, are, so to speak, the amplification. The condition of his reasoning, and I will conclude here, is radical equality. If for a long time sexuality was thought of from a basis of inequality of being, status, and culture, which required a strong distinction between the sexual journey in the psychic economy of a subject, truth-telling, and its codification in the marital realm, today, when sexuality is a terrain of equality, sexuality can only express itself in practices of equality. And this has fundamental repercussions on who we are and what we can experience as sexual subjects. We see the results in the extension of, for example, marriage rights, Me Too, and the denunciation of harassment, violence, and rape. Something of the inequality of the Christian world view has been broken, the doubt definitively, and has given way to a new and radically egalitarian economy of sexual subjects. This means that all the forms of domination that for centuries assured women's submission to men are now, in theory at least, of course, illegitimate. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Guillaume, for those both enlightening and provocative thoughts and ways of thinking about this text. What I'd like to do is three things. First, as I was listening to you raise two questions, I think it's really important to rethink the history of the desiring subject in these times of contested equality or an imagination of equality. And that's one of the most important ways of actualizing, in part, and a valuable way of actualizing this work. But there were two questions that came to my mind as I was listening to you. And then the other thing I'd like to do is pose a question about another way to think about the text and how it might relate to your presentation. So as I was listening to you, the first thing that I was thinking about was the difference between what it would mean to think about the relationship to law, not in terms of more and more of a subject of law, which was one way in which you were presenting it today, because of same-sex marriage, for instance, right? Not more a subject of law, but a different subject of law. And what would that entail? Because the question about more and more, of course, sets aside the entire regulatory legal framework that existed before and was equally ample. Prosecutions for sodomy, criminalization of homosexual relations, etc., which were a legal space just as much as same-sex marriage would be today. Different spaces of law, but just as much law. And so the first question I would want to ask is, should we be looking at it in terms of a legal transformation of the regulatory mechanism and what that would entail? When you speak about opening up a number of rights, I think that's right. But it is as a result of a transformation not in numbers of rights and responsibilities and obligations and duties and punishments, but of the quality of them. So that would be one thing. And then the second point has to do really just picking up with the last words that you added at the end of your intervention, in theory at least. So the second question really has to do with how do we think about this space of sexuality in, as you suggest, an era where there's perhaps an aspiration or an imagination among some people of a space of equality, but that surely is not a reality. And of course, you were gesturing to that by saying in theory, but that really does raise a question about how do we think about this space of sexuality today, and aspiration in a space of aspiring equality where in fact we're not there yet. And of course, what then does that do to issues of consent? And actually Samuel Galloway has written a lot about that, so maybe you'll jump in on this one. Okay, now, so those are two points, I think, that raise some questions we're going to have to grapple with about rethinking the history of the desiring subject in terms of these contemporary times. Me Too, questions of equality, questions of same-sex marriage. Now, the third point I'd like to make is to propose another way in which to read this text and then to ask you how it relates, because I think there must be a relationship between your actualization and this other one. Now, this other way of reading the text, I think, addresses the common critique among many of Foucault's readers and scholars, of the late Foucault especially, that the move towards care of the self, the move towards these practices of the self in the context of sexuality was somehow depoliticizing, right? And somehow rendered the Foucauldian project and the oeuvre more complacent in some way. That the turn to this investigation and all of these archival readings and close readings of these texts about that functionally really reverted to an ethic of the self, undermined the political force of his philosophy. Now, and of course, there are many who have felt this way. There are many who have written about this, in particular, Ella Myers in her book, Worldly Ethics, Democratic Politics and Care of the World, where she argues that Foucault's turn in the early 1980s away from the study of power towards subjectivation ultimately was depoliticizing. And I'll confess that sometimes I've struggled with this dilemma myself. But what I would say is that actually the publication of this volume, of volume 4 in particular, to me dispels that argument, because it really opens an avenue, it opens a direct link. In a way, to me, it represents the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle that creates the direct link between all of the work in the last 3 volumes of The History of Sexuality and his earlier examination of governmentality and critique of contemporary forms of governmentality, particularly neoliberal forms of governmentality. And the missing link actually comes in the final pages of the volume with the passages about St. Augustine that you were referring to and that you were pointing to as well, where Augustine is treating marital sexual relations, and Foucault finds in that analysis kind of the birth of what I would consider to be the modern legal subject. He calls it the sujet de droit. It would be the subject of law. It's basically the rights and responsibility-bearing individual who he sees emerge at this point, emerge through the analysis of consent and use in sexual relations among married couples. Now, that appearance of the legal subject at the end of Les Aveux de la Chair, to me, it's the piece that completes Foucault's critical project from the period 78, 79, 80, when he was particularly turning to questions of governmentality, what he called governmentality, which were forms of governance, forms of management, social, political, governmental management of society. With that piece now present in the history of sexuality, in a book which, and I think it's really important to distinguish the books from all of the other works. There was a certain, a greater finished touch to ideas in the books than in the brilliant lectures. Brilliant as they were, there was a certain way in which, with the book, Foucault was kind of was setting something down in a more deliberate way. So finding it in The History of Sexuality, Volume 4, finding it here at the end of the birth of the modern legal subject, I think, is very telling. And it's finally possible then to articulate Foucault's critique of contemporary neoliberal forms of governing in the full dimension of savoir, pouvoir, sujet, in the full dimension, in the 3 full dimensions which he spoke about so clearly in that modification section of Volume 2 of The History of Sexuality, which was for him the completion, at least at that point, the completion of his project, right, to bring these together. And of course, the way it works is that he had been searching in part for this subject when he was writing about neoliberalism, in part because he needed to distinguish the modern legal subject of modern political theory, Locke forward. He needed to distinguish that liberal legal subject that we're all familiar with from Homo economicus, from the economic subject, from the subject of eventually neoliberal economics. And in that work on neoliberalism, in 1979, it was clear that he was trying to suggest that the critique of neoliberalism depends on distinguishing the modern legal subject from the economic subject. And that is who you find, particularly right here at the end of volume 4, which of course, now that we look back, we can kind of piece together this jigsaw puzzle and see that that was the perfect moment, of course, about 1981, 82, when he was thinking about neoliberalism, when the modern subject would be born, when he drafted this, and then he needed to kind of find the antecedents. He needed to go back further to trace that history, that longer history. But with the emergence of the modern legal subject, we see ultimately his critique of contemporary forms of neoliberal governance, and the critique being, and this is what was clear from the birth of biopolitics, is that by contrast to the modern legal subject who can place limits on the sovereign and create a limited form of sovereignty with all of the liberal democratic notions that we are familiar with, checks and balances, limits on power, constitutional limits on power, etc. With the birth of the economic subject, what we get is a complete divestiture of the knowledge on the part of the collectivity, on the part of the government, on the part of anyone who would try to govern others, right? Because at that point, once the economic subject comes on the scene, only Homo economicus, only he or she, only he, the economic subject, knows his self-interests, right? And that was, I think, that the core of the critique of neoliberalism was this idea that that is baked into the logic and the practices of contemporary neoliberal Western society. And that, in fact, is kind of, it's placed, it's the assumption, it doesn't have a foundation, but it's placed in there, and then, of course, everything follows. And, of course, it was placed in there, Adam Smith, very clearly. You could read it very well. You could read it in Bentham, this idea that only the individual knows their self-interest best. Right? And, of course, it goes through to Human Capital and Gary Becker. But what it ends up being is, by contrast to the modern legal subject who was born and who arrives on the scene and who is here then, beginning with Augustine, we now have a subjectivity of the Homo economicus that has divested the collectivity of the possibility of having knowledge. And it's a much more radical state of affairs than it ever was before. Limited government before, now a blind, unknowing, unable to know government and collectivity, faced with the all-knowing, possessed individual, right? So, so now that is important. I would argue that the birth of the modern subject is actually one of the, perhaps the main thread of this work. I trace it through each stage. I kind of, in each of the earlier stages, I read Foucault, and there are passages where he says, you know, well, there was a juridical dimension to this, but it's not important, right? It wasn't important in baptism. It wasn't important in the penitential. It was there in the penitential. There is a juridical. It was kind of like you're a judge of yours, you know, you're facing a judge, but it wasn't important. Same for the monastic life. All these passages where he says, you know, no, c'est pas la loi, you know, something like that, where he's trying to distinguish it. Even when he gets to marriage, the early discussion of marriage prior to Augustine has the same feature. It's like, you know, well, there could be a juridical element, but it's not there yet. And so that I see throughout the whole text, suggesting to me that it is, in fact, one of the most animating pieces of the work, And of course, what it does ultimately is it allows us to then weave together all of the work on subjectivity, all of the work from 1980 to 1984, back into a full theory of knowledge, power, subject. Right? And so, of course, this is a response. This is a response to those who thought that in some way the ethics displaced the politics. That's the way we used to talk about it, or now the subjectivity displaced knowledge, power. I would say, no, on the contrary, and you see it right here, what we have is something where the theory of subjectivity folds back into a full critique. And of course, Foucault had said in The Courage of Truth that it would be a shallow reading of his work to think of power knowledge without the subject. Of course, he didn't need to say the inverse, but I think that that's what he was suggesting. It would be a shallow reading to read subjectivity without thinking, without weaving in knowledge and power into it. And so I think that what's so interesting about this text in particular is that it does provide that direct link that gives us an idea of how we could begin to start thinking about a robust critique that has all three dimensions. A robust critique of our present that really goes along all of these axes. Now the question then to you in part would be, so how do we weave that, how would we weave that effort back into, in part as one domain, these questions of sexuality, modern sexuality, contemporary sexuality in the context of an imagined but not yet realized equality. Okay?
Yeah.
So maybe you want to address some of that, and then we can open it up for conversation. Yeah?
Yes, thank you. It's a very tremendous question to know how can we make a link, so to speak, between what I spoke about on sexuality and the interpretation of a self tied with sexuality, and the way you develop a very robust critique or diagnosis of neoliberalism. I think, of course, I was wondering if at the end of his reflections, Foucault has told to himself that we had to invent new forms of subjectivities. It was one of his main topics, his practical topics, in fact, a way of seeing what part of transformations of a self is made possible in our diagnosis of the present. We know also that in some few sentences he has written that we had to imagine new forms of right also. So I wondered if there is not a connection between the task of inventing new forms of subjectivity in the context of neoliberalism and the way perhaps that right could be an instrument, a very useful one to promote these new forms of subjectivity. And so if this interpretation has an interest, I think it could open the way some people have defended the right to marriage for homosexuals, for instance, as a tool for promoting new forms of subjectivity. So that was the first point, because the risk, of course, of the analysis you made in a certain sense is to leave apart from the neoliberal movement to leave apart the kind of aspiration for new rights of the subject, and also perhaps the risk could be also to make as if the discourse, the different discourses on sex today stayed apart from the market as a point of hérésie, a point d'hérésie, so to speak. I think, of course, it will be. We have to keep in mind that Foucault, in the Will to Know, we have to keep in mind that he has developed this idea that the population as a reality, as a reality for the development of the market, is also concerned by some vital features, structures, including sex, of course. How could we interpret this question of sexuality inside the consideration of the development of neoliberalism? I think there is a sex market too, of course. There is a kind of interest for sex inside the neoliberalism itself. So that I'm not sure that the critique of the self when we see the possibilities of new forms of self could consist in having a radical experience of sexuality apart from the market itself. But it will be a new way of reflection. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, one of the difficult issues here, one of the most difficult issues here, I take it though, is that, you know, this is very laborious work of reading through this archive, as Foucault was doing, to glean how subjectivity can be shaped. You know, I mean, it's years-long projects of reading through massive amounts of historical archival data.
Yes.
You know, and then when we start thinking about more contemporary forms of sexuality and relations of power, you know, it's often tempting to draw conclusions or to say things about it, but it's going to require a lot of work. It's not going to be easy to make those statements, right? You know, it's tempting, but I think in a way it's dangerous. So how do we think about the intersection, as you were suggesting, of, say, sexuality, contemporary sexuality, and the questions of contemporary governance, neoliberal or others that are going on today? You'd have to. What kind of work would we have to do before we just start, you know, speculating, as we are, you know, tempted to? What archive would we need to explore? What is it that we would think, for instance, today shapes would have that influential shaping force on us? When you think, for instance, I mean, and of course I'm drawn here to think more about technologies maybe than about texts in the conventional published text form. Digital technologies, all of the ways in which today we are at times engaging written text, but at other times being influenced by the practices that we're engaging in. So this notion, for instance, that I was thinking about one path to go down would be to be thinking about the notion of the entrepreneurialism that is so much a feature of today's technologies in part, but of today's world, not only at the technological level, but at the sexual level as well, the entrepreneurialism that is involved with the presentation of the self on all of the different platforms that one is presented on, and the deep, extensive work that it would take to understand how those platforms and those experiences and those interactions, those constant interactions, whether they're on social media or on a laptop or on the internet or Googling or searching or surfing or whatever it is, would be affecting us today. Of course, and that would require an enormous archival work in the same way in which, this work was so laborious. Do you want to say a word?
Yes, but just a point. When I said that we were changing from episteme, what we're entering an episteme of equality, and when I said that sexuality became our business, it did not involve that it was then a question of pure subjectivity at all. Because, of course, you're perfectly right. In the way we try to govern our sexuality, we are also, at the same moment, governed by dispositif of sexuality. So there is a dispositif of sexuality today, in the way we. So, and it comes inside the way we try to govern our sexuality. It's very important to see, to study this apparatus, this dispositif of sexuality today. For example, in the way we expose ourselves, we present ourselves as a certain kind of subject, of sexual subject, and so on. But this is a point which has to do with the theory of norms of Foucault. In a way, I know you pay very much attention to a passage of a history of sexuality, of the use of pleasures, I think. But I would say that there is, of course, we don't have to read. We should not read Foucault as a first time as a theory of assujettissement, as a theory of norms inside which we are subjected, and in the second time as a theory of subjectivation, as a way we become subject of ourselves. I think that the two operations of assujettissement and subjectivation are tied inside our belongings to a regime of norms. So that at the same time we try to govern ourselves in the sexuality, and we are governed. And it seems to me that there is a complete theory of subject inside the norms that we have to keep in mind if we don't want to go too fast, in a way, in a theory of liberation. Foucault never thought it was a possibility for us to put the sex outside the norms, outside the market, outside the neoliberalism, and to see it as a deep experience of transforming ourselves. This operation of how can we transform ourselves is always tied with a reverse operation the way that we are governed in a certain manner
Right.
by norms themselves.
Right. Yeah. 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 Which was so much of the work that he did in Wrongdoing, Truth Telling as well, right? In the ways in which avowal serves both to kind of create our subjectivity and at the same time to subject ourselves to the social order.
Yes.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So those need to be linked in our analysis, for sure. Yeah. Jesus, do you want to jump in? Make sure your mic is on. It goes towards you. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Guillaume, and thank you, Bernard. And thank you for, because it's difficult sometimes to follow this book. It looks like it's an unfinished work sent to life before its time, like Henry III. And it's, as you say in your position paper, the one that you are going to be defending tomorrow, too. There is something missing here. And I think that it is true that there are many things that seem to be missing here. For instance, there is something that reveals or unveils the politicization of this profound examination of an old archive. And that's why you are here, right? No, to continue that conversation. There are moments in the book in which a medievalist, for instance, could say, I don't know, I'm not sure this is the right way of reading the, for instance, something like virginity, these amazing chapters on virginity, in which he conflates two completely different concepts. One, which is virginity, and the other that is chastity. Because virginity is certainly not something that belongs to legal or advice, but chastity is. It has a political content to it. So there is also a necessity to re-acknowledge ourselves to this old archive, because the archive, it still has lots of things to say. It is old, and I'm saying it's an old archive just because you, Bernard, said from the beginning it is an old archive. It is, and it isn't an old archive. In a certain way, it is so new that if you just look at the technologies, at the forms of preaching in mass Christian environments, and look at the role that occupies inoperativity as an essential element of sexuality, as a science or as a knowledge, then you find perhaps that archive is extraordinarily alive, and our way, maybe our difficulty is to counter the fact that this whole archive is not that old, that it is pretty new. That the way in which it has permeated juridical activity, regulating from the 13th century onwards, from the Fourth Lateran Council onwards, to Trento, to nowadays, for instance, marriage, or what do you do within marriage? Because the question of one thing is sexuality, and a completely different thing is sex. The one is that science created throughout time that Foucault is interested in understanding and building. He wants to understand. He says that in 1978 in What is Critique. You know, I want to understand what is this science that we can call sexuality. And he says that in that moment because he's saying something absolutely fundamental as well, that I think it's maybe, I don't know, I don't know if this is something that you can, that you have an input about, which is, let's understand that science, let's understand sexuality, because understanding sexuality will be one of the ways in which critique can be put forward, saying, I do not want to be governed that way, which is how he defines critique, as an inservitude volontaire. I don't want to be governed that way. But in order to say that, you have to understand how you are being governed and the activity of the archive and how the archive may seem old, but it is new and it is pervasive. And it's not just in Christian, white, male America. It's beyond that. And that's just a commentary. I have 1,000 questions, but I have already spoken too long, so sorry.
Yeah, what that makes me think, though, is, of course, we're missing an enormous piece of the story, of course, ending in, as we do, in, the 5th century.
Like 13th to 16th century, when marriage is regulated.
Right. And it is interesting that the project was ultimately, or at least presented as being a 4-part project. Of course, the question then becomes, how do we, in part the question then, the critical question is, how do we connect then where volume 4 ends with the birth of a legal subject, un sujet de droit, that is tied to a subject of lust, to ultimately, in the 19th century, the birth of what we would call sexuality, right? And of course, there would be a ton of work to be done on those archives. Your point being, I take it, of course, that the influence of this is so dominant on that period, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it still is, because the system of mass communication that is preaching, mass, the constant reintroduction of all those doctrinal elements in absolutely every single one of every single scientific body of knowledge in the 18th and 19th century is pervasive. So, sorry, Guillaume, you want to say something? And
Yes, I think it's the question of the archive you spoke about. You say it's an archive, and it's not at the same time. It's very interesting because, of course, when we read this book, Les Aveux de la Chair, we have a kind of special archive, the archive of Christianity and the Christian fathers and so on. And when Foucault is studying this archive during 4 centuries, he discovers suddenly this question of sujet de droit, legal subject. And we realize then that he has really forgotten all the juridical archive from the Roman Empire to the 5th century. There is not a word, there is not a single word on the way marriage is understood as a problem of legality, and he stays in a strong and very strong and very but very narrow culture of Christianity, and that's a problem, because we would like to come back at the end of the reasoning of Foucault on Augustine. We would like to come back to this history of law inside our Western societies by which marriage was codified and so on. And there is not a single word on Foucault about this topic.
Yeah, but I take it that what he's trying to do there is not to deny that marriage was a regulated was a legally regulated space, but to introduce the notions of the importance of the notions of consent, consentement that arise with Augustine, at least on his reading, and that in that way kind of transform, right? So it's got to be. I mean, and he's pretty. He'll often say, you know, there were prohibitions before, there were legal prohibitions before this, and there was legal regulation of marriage. So it's not a story that law all of a sudden pops into place. It's a story that the notion of a responsible, I mean, I take it that's the notion of the responsibilizable subject, the notion of the subject who can be made responsible in this particular way, responsible to God in Augustine's work, then somehow transforms the way we think about our subjectivity at that point, right? So it's really the change, the issues of consent, consentement, usage, usus, that are something that create a different notion of subjectivity, even though, as of course you're right, there would have been all of the legal framework going back to, you know, the tables, right?
Just one thing, and I will shut up.
No, not at all. Keep on going.
I just want to say I don't
keep on going.
think that Latin consensus can be translated as consent. I think consensus is a political and legal structure in which, in particular, in the case of Saint Augustine, the sexual history of Saint Augustine is the matter for a book, and that book was written by Saint Augustine. So it's the Confessions.
Confessions.
It's when he visits a brothel with his father, with Patricius, and then he has an erection, and he asks, "Why can I control my body?" And then his father is very happy about all that, and runs to Monica and tell her, "Oh wow, you didn't know what happened. These adolescents, you know." The inquietudine adolescentibus, I don't know, whatever, and you know, and then Monica completely frightens and tries to counter that by creating something that is politically tolerable. First of all, separating him from the mother of his child years later, and then trying to marry him to somebody through this kind of consensus. This is the kind of political and legal structure that I think is what...
Is being born at that time, you're saying?
Yeah.
That is the political legal structure.
Yeah, so it's a political and legal structure that exists in Roman society. And that you can, it's called consensus, which is to be of the same agreement, but not the kind of agreement that we understand when we talk about sexual consent or consent today. I think it's different. But the good thing with this archive is that you can do creative things with it. I'm not being some sort of Latinist fundamentalist, first of all, because I'm not a Latinist, but also because I believe that you can do things with that. I want to underscore the extraordinary creativity of Foucault when he examines laboriously this archive. That's all.
You can see the difference when you compare with a famous chapter of his book from Peter Brown.
Right.
here, published here in Columbia University Press in 1988. So it's incredible. It's the same kind of story with the book Les Aveux de la Chair. And there is a last chapter called Augustine, Sexuality and Society, where, and he explains the way you did in the same way. It's really important to go back to Confessions as a kind of self-experience of sexuality. And yes, it changes a lot.
Let me open it up to other voices and interventions. Yes, do you want to grab the mic, Samuel? And you want to make sure it's on just by clicking it towards you in front.
Okay, I think I got there.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So my question is about the kind of ambiguity of confession is also an avowal, and with the idea of an avowal, also the potential then for a disavowal. And so if confession is an operative practice in these matrices of the subject, knowledge, and power, then is there, what's the space then for like a disavowal or a becoming imperceptible, right, for sexuality, so that one is able to articulate or express desires, or more with Foucault, relations of pleasure, right, that don't necessarily require the elaboration of a subject in advance, I'm thinking, for instance, of some of the later interviews that he gives, especially Friendship as a Way of Life, but then also, common conventions like the gay hanky code, right, which allow signaling of announcements of desired pleasure relations that don't necessarily articulate a concrete subject position or identity, just rather a practice that one wants to engage in, depending on where the hanky code is flashed, right, and how. So yeah, those two things, kind of the becoming imperceptible as a form of resistance, perhaps, to the kind of compulsion to confess the truth of one's sexuality, so the way that confession also opens up the space for like a disavowal or a becoming imperceptible.
I think you've got some thoughts on that, though, Samuel, don't you?
A few.
A few.
But I'm
So why
curious
don't
to
you
open it up.
well, so, I mean, why don't you develop some of your thoughts then? I mean,
Well, it just seems to me that, if we're talking about a regime of sexuality, we want to embed it in the kind of modes of governance that structure it, right? And so if we take seriously the kind of the being compelled to speak the truth of one's sex and sexuality, characteristic, for instance, Bernardo, of your thesis in Exposed, right, that there's this desire to expose oneself, to live one's truth, right, and have that truth be legally recognized, then I'm wondering what the extent is for a kind of a reflexive praxis of wanting to evade some of that, of wanting not to be so readily recognized either by regimes of truth or law, right? And so the limits of those two paradigms and the space for experimentation in resistance to them that are also available through confession as, the aveu is both a avowal and a disavowal.
Kalinka, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to notice that the book is not called Les Confessions de la Chair, but Les Aveux de la Chair. So I think that the term avowal here is really crucial. And it's interesting because I think there's something missing, the modern period, because the first acceptation you find in the Littré dictionary of the word avouer, to confess, if we want, refers to a modern usage of the verb, meaning that we used to confess someone as a lord, actually. So it's linked to feudal law, and it was the act of the vassal acknowledging someone as. So we used to confess someone before confessing something. And I think that this relationship, this question of submission, is crucial. And I think it's hard to articulate it also because it is a kind of blank concept in philosophy in general. I mean, there's this philosopher Manon Garcia who wrote this book called On ne n'est pas soumise, on le devient, just to notice that this concept is not that much studied as a concept that, meaning that the agreement actually to submit oneself to someone, not because of, and it's true that the Christian here, the Christian subject, submit himself, and we don't talk too much about it, but because of doubt and evil are risking the truth of his subject. But I think there's I don't know how to articulate this, but I think there's something interesting to say about this submission relationship in the vow, and also we were talking about the subjectification, but we have to talk about also about the objectification, both in the Christian subject, as the Christian subject objectifies himself. Because he's the object of his own discourse, but I think that's true also of the subject that we have now when we become objects also in the different platforms we actually using. So it's not clear at all, but just like two roads, I think we might need to explore too.
Anyone else want to jump in at this point? Yeah? Here. Yeah, it helps. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If I don't remember if he addresses in the earlier volumes, not so much the avowal or the truth-telling, but the truth, embodying the truth in a performative way, acting the truth, not speaking it, not avowing it, not telling it. Because it just seems that in the experimentation, if we're going to go into technologies of the self in the current modern interpretation, there might be room for something other than truth-telling, but truth being. Inhabiting that truth in your behaviors, but not speaking it, not avowing it. Which is not to say it's clandestine, but to say it's a more, it's more transgressive probably, but.
And you wrote about that some in your piece, about the difference between truth being and truth telling. But let's have another, there was another comment in back. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I was really interested in this this question of what kind of archives could we be sort of laboring over, and particularly this point you made about the divestment of knowledge on the part of the collectivity, as this being a sort of crucial shift that we see in the emergence of the neoliberal subject. And in terms of thinking about archives to look at, one thing that I've been quite interested in is the fact that these neoliberal thinkers that Foucault talks about in the Birth of Biopolitics, so people like Gary Becker, to a lesser extent Theodore Schultz, were also pioneers in the economics of fertility and applied economic analysis to ideas around sort of population growth and population control. So there is this quite explicit preoccupation on the part of these neoliberal thinkers and economists with questions of sex. And of course, all the implications that human capital has in terms of gender roles, the role of the mother, the role of the family. So kind of going back to this point you made about sort of the divestment of knowledge from the collectivity and the human capital subject as the one who knows her or his interest. Obviously, another way of looking at this is the way in which the family has actually been sort of recapitulated as sort of the source of knowledge and the source of interest. So the mother knows, or is in the position of knowing what will enhance the human capital of the child. So that's sort of one thing. And then sort of sexual decisions being made on the basis of things like opportunity cost, on the basis of things like interest rates. So that's just sort of my 2 cents on a potential archive to be explored, which I think isn't being looked at quite enough. So questions of fertility and population control.
Yeah, definitely. Tu veux répondre à quelques questions? So, yeah, and of course, so much of the human capital calculus was precisely in that area, precisely in reproduction, right? I mean, reproduction writ large, not only biological reproduction, but reproduction of wealth and in those ways. So that seems right. Those are definitely archives that we would need to examine. And on the question of disavowal and avowal, what it makes me think is that, of course, it's and performance, right? Is that we are approaching these acts in a metaphorical way, right? And Foucault does approach them in a very metaphorical way, which is part of the brilliance of the analyses. So we're not simply focusing on the narrow confession, right? But on the ways in which we are broadly contesting and telling truths about ourselves, right? And doing it not only in verbal form, but in performative form, etc., such that the examination which had preceded this, and it's in here as well, of the examination of self, of an examination of conscience, the thinking about the day's activities, and the different way in which thinking about the day's activities affects us as subjects versus maybe trying to relate oneself to God, say, of any denomination or any faith. Those are all metaphorically, I take it, what are these acts that are part of the constitution of the self, and it's in those transformations that they are. So I think that we do necessarily investigate or need to investigate, not only avowal or strictly confession, but also resistance to avowal, the spaces where one wouldn't want to, or where one didn't want to present the self, which is precisely what then ties into the critique, how not to be governed in this way, right? I don't know if that's helpful, but do you want to say something? We can go back to you.
Yes, perhaps there is a. It's also a question of confession and how do we. What does it make to confess something or to confess to someone, and so on. I think there is a. It would be very interesting to examine the philosophical project of Foucault as a broad history of confession, in a certain sense, in different significations, and in fact, confession is a kind of fil rouge.
Fil qui continue.
Oui, un fil conducteur.
Ouais. Comment on dit fil conducteur? Yeah, through line.
Through line.
Leitmotif.
Yes,
Yeah.
leitmotif in the works, the different works of Foucault, we can see, and the question is, why is it the case? So why, and I think it's tied with several reasons. First one, confession is a way for someone to tell the truth on his or her acts to someone who is in authority to demand this confession, so that when you speak the differences between to confess someone or something, we don't have to forget that for me the most important is not someone or something, but the address. The address, because you have to confess to an address. And so that confessions are, in a certain sense, a culture of narrations addressed, always addressed. And of course, in the history of confession, the time when confession could be a self-experiment without this address became very relevant. I think on the text that Foucault wrote on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rousseau, juge de Jean-Jacques, and the space, the kind of new space, the project of a confession for himself, not addressed as taken in our culture. It's very important. And it's very important also because nowadays we are more and more faced with a certain kind of confessions that a sociologue in France, Dominique Mémy, has called autobiographie d'institution. Because she wanted to emphasize the fact that, for example, the people who are looking for a job, or the ill people, and so on, have always to confess a part of themselves to a special institution in order to reclaim something from the institution itself. And so there is, I think, there are, I think, 3 levels of a confession in our culture. A confession tied with obligation to tell the truth on someone who is in authority to reclaim this truth. A confession when this obligation to tell the truth on someone disappears, creating a new space of expression, and a social experiment of confession, which is nowadays very important. And it's very interesting to examine, as I've done it in other occasions, to examine the way the precarious people have the obligation to confess their story, a new form of veridicity, in fact, in order to be recognized as subjects of who deserve to be apprehended as subjects. For example, foreigner people, ill people, and workers without work. So that was one direction I wanted to perhaps to stress, this history of confession. I think it would be very interesting to enter the work of Foucault in regard with these 3 directions on confession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only thing I would add at this point, though, just in terms of where our conversation is right now, is that I think it's important to emphasize that this Les aveux de la chair is not, it's de la chair. In other words, the notions of flesh, of sin, are very important here, and we shouldn't simply, in other words, we shouldn't simply focus on this work as being one that gives rise to avowal, because when you look at the other work, right, the notion of avowal is present as well. And so when you go back to the Louvain lectures from 81, wrongdoing, truth-telling. It's the function of a vowel in justice, but it stretches from, Homer all the way to 1977, right? So a vowel is not, a vowel and notions of confession play an important role in here, but as a particular form of a vowel, right? It's the relationship, there's, exomologèse and there's exegoresis, and it's a transforming forms of a vowel that a vowel is not born in volume 4, right? So the question becomes, what is the form that a vowel takes here? And of course, it's in a vowel that is in relationship to one's relationship with God, to sin, and the whole framework of flesh that didn't exist before. Vowels did, truth-telling did, and there's a whole history of that he does in the other works. So so that's one thing that we should make sure not to. So this is really an analysis of the way in which our forms of a vowel were transformed as a result of this patristic tradition and took on a different character. And it's in that transformation of a truth-telling that has this much longer arc from the 8th century, before the Common Era, and even further back, right, all the way to the present, and forms of vowel in contemporary forms of sexuality, right? So I just wanted to make sure that we keep that in mind, because it's kind of the interaction of a vowel and Christian dogma that creates the particular form in which subjectivities are shaped at this period, right? Yes. Who else wants in? Sam, you wanted back in a little bit. Go ahead.
I guess I was thinking about the essay on the concept of the dangerous individual, right? And how you have a confession, but a lack of a statement of intent, right? And so part of what makes the individual dangerous in this case is that they say, yeah, I did it, but I'm not going to provide you, I'm not going to confess. So it's a confession that also isn't an adequate confession. And for Foucault in that essay, there's this, what makes it dangerous, right, is that it puts this extra pressure on the juridical game, right, to provide the link between the deed and the doer, right? And so you have a confession, but then you also have a kind of, maybe not exactly a disavowal, but you have a denial of the satisfaction of the juridical game, right? I did it, but I'm not going to tell you why, right? I guess maybe less dramatically, I was thinking also of the way people refer to their intimate others or spouses as partners, right? It's an avowal that kind of disavows at the same time, right? Yes, I have an intimate person in my life, but whether they're a husband or a wife, whether we're straight or gay, is somewhat ambiguous, right? And purposefully so. Or at least, maybe if not purposely, at least in effect, right? It ambiguates the scene as much as it discloses, right? So I'm wondering about those kinds of confessions, right? I did it, but I'm going to confess in a way that perhaps inadvertently or maybe even intentionally jams up the functioning of the game of truth-telling and even truth-living in exactly the same way, a kind of more pedestrian, oh yes, my partner leaves, it's a confession, yes, I have this person, they're my partner, but who they are, what the nature of our relationship is, what my sexuality is somewhat indiscernible from that simple designation. I don't know if that helps clarify what I was getting at a little bit earlier about becoming imperceptible, but, and then I've already spoken too much, so.
No. I think it's very important when we realize that the confession takes place in a social and cultural space when the confessor is a little disappearing, vanishing. Because if you pay attention to the fact that confession is addressed to a confessor whose function is to examine the way you have told the truth on your own acts. There will always be a kind of not repressive hypothesis, because we can't use this expression, but there will always be a kind of normative function played by the confessor, and it becomes very relevant. But when this function of a confessor, in a certain sense, has not really perhaps disappeared, but has become more and more ambiguous, because tied with several examinators or several observators, and then the possibility for the confession to play this double function that you speak of becomes very relevant in a certain sense.
Amina, do you want to jump in? And then come to you.
I guess I tend to read Foucault as a phenomenologist, which is bizarre, I know. And
No, that's right.
this, on one end, this text has a double meaning. On one end, we see the birth of phenomenology in Catholic confession. This idea to make yourself present to yourself as a subject, an observer of yourself in this like truth-telling process, but even the act as a researcher going through the archive is making yourself present to yourself, but through this kind of separation between what I'm studying and what I am at the same time. And I see this kind of double gesture in Foucault, and it seems that it becomes clear in it that there isn't as, you know, the researcher isn't as hidden as it is here, you know, that especially in the analysis of the confession, it seems that the subject which we've been searching for that is present as a researcher and present in the analysis kind of comes together. And I think that's kind of what you guys have been saying in different ways from another way around, that you can't talk about the subject without talking about a certain exercise of power and a certain kind of legal structure at play, and a certain type of knowledge and a truth game as well. And that's not detached. And that's always been kind of a question mark, I think, in some way in Foucault, or at least the points haven't come together. But in this text, it seems like it's all kind of coming together, you know, not only the subject in the text, or in this discourse about knowledge and power, but also Foucault as researcher. And I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts about this, especially when we're talking about returning to an archive, right? You know, like what do we return to? Or do we return to like a digital platform in which like we kind of, does it function in the same way as applied to today? Is there something we can return to where we go through that kind of a phenomenological reduction, you know, when we go through that process of self-presencing, but also pushing away certain type of discourses that have maybe have influenced or cultivated our subjectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. Actually, this the phenomenological aspect, which of course it's ironic too, because at least most of his efforts in the 50s, and we'll be seeing this as the work is published of the Cours avant le Collège de France, was a reaction against, was a rejection of a phenomenological approach, Husserl, etc., very explicitly. But you're entirely right, I think, that there is a way in which the reading of these texts operate in a phenomenological way. And I hadn't put my finger on that the way you just did, but I think because it is well, actually, well, you know, it is the complicated relationship to the experience, right? And of course, the other thing that's really interesting here, which is that this notion of experience, which plays such an important role in the history of sexuality, which was so present in Volume 1 and continues to be present, is actually a notion of experience that is tied to, that at least he traces back to Binswanger and his work on Binswanger from the 1950s. This is something that that will become apparent soon. So it is trying to understand an experience, trying to understand this experience, trying to almost phenomenologically understand what it does to you to engage in a form of examination of the self or a form of direction, or what it does to you to be obedient in the ways in which obedience became such an important aspect of the patristic tradition and the different forms of obedience, the different ways in which one had to be obedient, which he develops here. It is really, it is kind of like how experiencing that, doing that, kind of what it does to us, which is right. Yeah.
Yes, it's.
I just wanted to add that, you know, looking at an aspect of confession as kind of like it's a poison, but it has a cure in the same way. That like this type of modification of the vow that comes along in the rise of Christianity, on one end, like sets in motion a certain type of oppressive techniques, right? Where there's an obedience that is ordered by the individual to either the religious or the legal apparatus. But on the other end, it seems like, at least with the other volumes of sexuality, something that confession offers that the other forms of different oppressive tactics of sexuality is that confession allows this self-presencing, right? That it allows like a glimmer, like, yes, I have to look into myself and tell a truth of myself to someone else, but it still allows this internal dialogue with myself that is private, right? And that I have a choice to confess or not. And this kind of this internal dialogue that's necessary in this truth-telling seems to be a space of liberation along its modifications on the line, or another problem of power at the same time. Mm-hmm. So like, oh, I have this secret about myself. And then we were talking about the contemporary forms that now I don't have a organized institution, but all institutions want that secret about me as well. Or even forms of knowing. Certain forms of knowing that we saw in the 20th century focuses on this kind of Descartesian view of the subject, this awareness of oneself and what they're experiencing is happening, I think, in the 20th century as well, that it is this return to the observer and this return to the subject as well. I don't know, maybe I'm just going off a little bit. Is this making sense? Yeah.
Yes, perhaps just one thing. You spoke of phenomenology in a radical way. I would say that perhaps the philosophical method of Foucault has consisted, of course, in criticizing the desire of phenomenology of retour aux choses. And in fact, he has clearly revealed that we never have a primitive access to the things because we are tied always with, we belong always in an order of discourse. So that les mots don't allow us to have an access to les choses. It's les mots contre les choses. the general method of Foucault. But in this philosophical decision, there is perhaps a new phenomenology of discourse which is involved. I mean, when Foucault speaks, for example, when he pays attention to the experience of a confession, we really see in a very specific way what space, what concrete space the confession opens in the double direction you spoke of. I mean, of course, in a first direction that someone is going to have a power to someone who is confessing, but also in the fact that by confessing, I always have a choice not to confess myself or to tell some different things. So I've always the choice of creating an experience in the experience itself. And this possibility is very crucial, I think. But it's always opened by the kind of phenomenology of discourse Foucault makes in a certain sense. And it's always very impressive, because when we read Les Aveux de la Chair, for example, and when we read this Christian father, we always ask ourselves, am I this subject that Foucault is speaking about? Exactly. Am I this subject? And I am this subject, and I am not this subject. So that this experience, this counter-experience, is really a crucial point of the writing of Foucault himself, of the art of writing.
Jesus?
But I don't want to change the conversation.
I don't, unless someone else wants to jump in on this particular point. Go ahead.
Okay, I really don't want to change the conversation. I just have a question for you. So the question is something about your paper and this link, how you see this missing link that is the sujet de droit, or the how do you say, the
subject of law, or
subject of law,
legal subject.
With the neoliberal subject, and then you quote Becker when he says it comes from a belief that the government usually makes things worse rather than making them better for the bulk of the population. It's an analysis, it may be a wrong analysis, but that's the analysis. When I say, or you can say, it's an analysis, it may be a wrong analysis, but it's an analysis. When I say I'm a small government person, I'm making the judgment that whatever the imperfection when the private sector operates, the effects are worse than when I see the government operating. Now, other people may say that the evidence for that is not so clear, that in other sectors it is different. I recognize that. But that is what it would be based on. Recognize that is, I avoue, j'avoue ça. That would be perfect translation. But but that is what it would be based on. So it all comes down to a set of beliefs. It counts. Maybe the evidence doesn't count. Maybe the analysis is a wrong analysis. But what happens is that this is a set of beliefs.
Yeah.
And this set of beliefs has become a certain discipline. There is a very narrow line differentiating what is a set of beliefs from what is a science or a discipline or an economic discipline, for instance, for that matter, or a political activity that encompasses policy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in that sense, is that where the missing link is, in the fact that what Foucault also demonstrates is that in the end, sexuality is the formation of a set of beliefs that maybe, and that what is interesting to know is how does a set of beliefs become that, transgresses this narrow line between belief and science and becomes widespread, and the point of departure of policy, of forms of repression, of forms of oppression, of forms of practices and experiences.
So So I think that some of that work was already present in terms of in terms of showing the construction of, for instance, modern conceptions of sexuality. I think that what was the missing kind of link, it seemed to me, was in the history and the trajectory of how we actually got to the liberal modern self that gets displaced with the Homo economicus, with the economic self. In other words, it's more, the way I imagine this kind of puzzle is that the theoretical work, we understood what it was supposed to do, but we actually didn't see the concrete link ultimately, and that's what this presents. The reason that I think that the Becker passage is so interesting, because it to me it kind of confirms the critique, right? It really shows up the way in which, and this was in a conversation where we were talking about empirical evidence. We were talking about the need to base everything on empirical evidence, that the only reliable authority in this context of economic analysis is the evidence, right? And then, bam, when push comes to shove, the response was simply, well, I'm just a small government guy, right? And yeah, right. I believe that. And why? Well, because I think Foucault is right. It's because the subject that gives birth to this form of economic analysis is one that has all the knowledge. So therefore, the government couldn't possibly be in a position to be knowledgeable or to be able to function in that way. So I view that as the confirmation of the critique. But I think that what was missing was the historical trajectory that made sense as to why we would want to go back all the way to the ancient Greeks, and then kind of navigate through the Stoics and finally get to Augustine to see kind of and stop there. Although one would expect that there would have been an ongoing project to bring us more probably to the present, but at least just to find there the modern legal subject who then gets displaced. And so that's the sense in which I see the missing link present in this book. So kind of like putting in that last foundation. But of course the question becomes, how do we continue to actualize that? How do we actualize it both in the context of sexual relations today and in the larger, broader context of the other domains of relations of power that are so critical today? Do you want to have a final concluding thought to share with us? And then,
thanks so much. No, I was just wondering that we did not answer to the question of on economy of sex and family as a source of knowledge and capital of the children. And I don't want to. I find that very, very interesting. And I don't want to have an answer on this question, but just perhaps to suggest, and it's a point that came to me by listening to you and to you, and also by reading the last chapter of Elisabeth Lacher, devoted to Augustine. But in fact, there is always on Foucault's reflection this question of the limits. Of course, he has clearly established since Les Mots et les Choses how the question of life itself was a crucial question to reveal the question of man. If you want to make clear the figure of man, you have to take it into different forms of life, work, and language as a kind of spatial structures and as a domain of studies which allows you to study the man as someone lively, for example. And so what you speak about, it's very important to go back to this anthropological background of a man who is alive, who is taken as someone whose life in himself is a value, a problem, and a domain to study. And in fact, I was thinking that there is a kind of parallel between Les mots et les choses and Les Aveux de la chair. I just would like to end by this parallel, in a certain sense. In Les mots et les choses, the question was, for Foucault, the practical question was, is it possible to have a critics of this knowledge that I studied in my own archaeology. And we know that he has an answer, he got an answer studying what he called in Les mots et les choses counter-sciences, les contre-sciences. Counter-sciences developed inside the episteme, the new modern episteme of human sciences. For example, not for example, psychoanalysis, Lacan, la linguistique, the linguistic, Benveniste, and the ethnology, Lévi-Strauss. And these three counter-sciences have the same temptation to point out some unconscious forms of knowledge by which the question is no more the question of a man, but the question of his unconscious. And in a certain sense, but of course it's just a parallel that I am suggesting, but in a certain sense, the last word of the history of sexuality, written by Foucault, reveals a kind of unconscious inside the reflections on Augustine. Because what is remarkable when we study this last chapter devoted to Saint Augustin, to Augustine, is the surging of an involuntary movement inside the voluntary psyche. This involuntary movement, it is what Foucault calls libido, in fact, so that we can say that it's a kind of unconscious movement that appears inside the psyche itself. And I think so Saint Augustine in this book belongs to the history of Christian culture, but in a certain sense, in a radical sense, it doesn't belong to this culture because he has revealed this point of the involuntary, of the libido, of the unconscious inside our psyche. And it makes a bridge, therefore, to the kind of lecture we should have, when we wonder how it is possible to go outside the anthropological disposition of our moderns in Les mots et les choses.
Excellent. All right. Well, that made me think that maybe where we do end then is with this last sentence from Les Aveux de la chair, right, which ties together finally le sexe, la vérité et le droit, and suggests that that's where we need to mine to get at issues of modern Western society. Okay, so thank you very much, Guillaume Leblanc. Join me in thanking
you.
Guillaume and Xavier for your translation. Thank you all. And so the next session will be on Adorno's negative dialectics, and hopefully the live stream will work that time so that everybody can join in. All right, thank you, and see you soon. Thank you. Thank you.